Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee. It is May 1st, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the revenue sharing agreement that could be coming to the Big Ten and the SEC, break that down a little bit. We've talked about it a little bit, but definitely gaining some traction over there in those two conferences. Then we'll talk about UAB football, They joined a Players Association, so the very first college football team to join a Players Association. Kind of want to break down what that means and what the future of that might look like. And then we'll get a little bit of a transfer portal update in there for you. The portal just closed for everyone that is not a graduate transfer. They still have until, I believe, at midnight tonight to join, but it is closed for everyone else, so I want to break down who all is in as of right now and where some of the guys are leaning, and then we'll finish it off with a Spotlight Wednesday, and we'll talk about the Nebraska Cornhuskers. A ton going into this season. Dylan Raiola obviously coming over is a huge deal over there, and he had a great day on Saturday in their spring game, so we'll break down everything around the Cornhuskers. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all, we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, your comment on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of your screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of a fun, interactive experience here, and maybe call me out on something that I might have not brought up, or just ask a question that you're wondering about. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about this revenue sharing agreement that could be coming to the SEC and the Big Ten fairly soon. We've talked about kind of what the future looks like for player compensation a lot on this show, and there's a number of different ideas thrown out there, right? We could do just straight up employment and contracts where the universities would just straight pay the players. You could stick with the NIL model where kids can only benefit off endorsement deals and that type of thing. But it seems like revenue sharing has been something that has caught on a lot of traction, especially among the players and the coaches who were former players, which we'll get into when we get into the UAB story. But this is a still kind of unrefined proposal, so still a ways to go to get to where they want to go, but it's called the modern model is what they're calling it, and they're hoping that this subsides or pretty much does away or settles that lawsuit that they have about NIL back pay that has been going on. It's called House versus the NCAA, that is set to go to trial next January, and that is a huge deal in college football. We talked about it last week. I said it's probably the most consequential thing happening in college football right now. So a lot of teams and a lot of athletic directors in particular are trying to get out in front of it. It looks like the settlement payment for that would be about $15 million to $20 million within each school to go around to, I believe it's 7,000 former players that they believe deserve to be paid in this settlement, and that's a lot of money for a lot of these schools. These athletic directors don't necessarily have that sitting around. Some do, don't get me wrong, but not necessarily the vast majority of schools. I can't remember what the exact number was. I want to say somewhere around 10% would be under some very intense financial circumstances if they were forced to pay that amount. So they're hoping that this possibly settles it for a number lower than that $15 to $20 million. But even if it does settle it for that number, at least you put that in the rearview mirror, and now you can focus on the present, which is, getting as much money in your pocket as possible to prepare for the discussions coming down the road for the structure of college football. And this obviously has a lot to do with that. ESPN reported on Monday night that them and the Power 5 conferences are in deep discussions to talk about this revenue sharing plan. Now, there's not really an idea of how it would be distributed or what that would look like per se, but it seems like it's gaining traction and people are actually having real conversations about it, and it's something that likely should have been happening for quite some time, if we're being totally honest with each other. But it's great, obviously, that the SEC and the Big Ten are leading the way on this. It's the two conferences that dictate a ton of the power in the grand scheme of things around college football. They're the two teams that are leading pretty much every category you could possibly think of when it comes to college football, whether it's money or talent acquisition or results on the field. Those are the two conferences that kind of set the pace. So these two conferences getting out ahead of this is absolutely fantastic. It's something that absolutely needed to happen, and I think it's something that we've been kind of fighting over for quite some time, partly because some people couldn't get their head around NIL, and then you'd have to throw this into the works, and it becomes a whole other thing. It goes back to the argument I've made on here a number of times where the NCAA had every chance to create this as a very smooth transition from, players getting a little bit of money with NIL to getting, more substantial money with revenue sharing, or getting into contracts and having a more stable foundation to work from. All of this is just, the NCAA being behind the ball of where they need to be. So now the conferences have stepped up. They've, approached their media deals and have said, this needs to happen, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't happen, it could cost us much more money with that back pay lawsuit, or with just figuring out a different way to go about business when it comes to paying these players. Jeffrey Kessler, the attorney for the back pay case, did not comment, so doesn't seem like there's a ton of traction quite yet to get that settled. Obviously, some of the details of this proposal needs to be ironed out for, the other party to listen to that, because there's no reason for Jeffrey Kessler and his team to listen to a conversation that, isn't fully thought out yet, I suppose. So I think there's going to be a ton of conversation around this over the next little bit. I think there will be so much going into what's kind of what the future of the NCAA looks like. But the reality is, this could be kind of the knockout punch for them. We've talked about it for a long time. The NCAA has kind of been hanging on for by a thread for just a remarkable amount of time, whether it's, with NIL or with the transfer portal, or just with, the respect they have around college football in particular, but just college sports overall. I think it's been waning a lot in recent years. And one of the interesting things is, if you get this new way of things, and if you settle that suit, there's a reality where the NCAA, in the antitrust case, the damages could be tripled in that case if this does not, get fully resolved the way that the NCAA is very much hoping that they do. And if the case goes to jury and the NCAA loses, which Jeffrey Kessler and that group have said time and again, they feel incredibly confident that if it does go to trial, they will win. So that's not necessarily the best news for the NCAA. But if that were to happen, essentially the NCAA would be on the hook for about $4.2 billion in some form or another, in terms of NIL back pay, in terms of different things that go into this suit. So that's a crazy amount of money. Essentially, no matter how well you're doing financially, that's a crazy amount of money, and it's something that apparently 7,000 current and former athletes would be entitled to payment, whether that's, from appearing on former video games and things of that nature. There's plenty of things that go into this, but point blank, if the NCAA has to pay $4.2 billion to these former athletes or to whomever, they're dead. A quote from Matt Whitner, one of the a sports law attorney that CBS Sports talked to. He said, "This is the case that could end the NCAA." So it feels like, excuse me, it does feel like there's a lot of things happening around the NCAA, and it feels like all of this has kind of been chipping away at a tree, right? You have to take a number of whacks for it to start to fall down. But once you take that last one, it falls down pretty quickly. And I think there is that case where, Florida State and the ACC battling has been really tough on the NCAA. Not setting up NIL rules has been really tough. Transfer portal struggles has been insanely tough. Tons of teams moving around and kids moving around and fans being mad and coaches being mad. All of this has been chipping away at the NCAA. But they needed a big thing to take them down, and it sounds like that last swing is starting to come with this new deal. And if it's $4.2 billion, the NCAA is pretty much cooked and pretty much has to be in damage control, I guess. I don't even know what the future would look like for the NCAA, but I know for a fact it would have very, very little to do with college football, because college football right now is in a position where the most powerful people in the room are Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti, are the guys that are controlling the biggest conferences in the country. So the NCAA essentially will not have any leg to stand on, especially if they lose that financial foothold that they have over some of these other conferences. So the NCAA is in trouble. It looks like that this could be the official knockout punch. Now, how quickly that's going to happen, I'm not necessarily sure. And what we see on the other side of that, I think, is the bigger question here. What is the governing body? Are the rules in place? Are they fair? Do they make sense for the players and for the teams? And also, are they the same across the board? I've talked about this a little bit, but having different conferences is a fantastic thing if you're talking about the play on the field, right? You love to see different styles. You'd love to see regional matchups, although that's kind of slowly going out the window as we get further and further down the road of conference realignment. But at the end of the day, having different conferences that have totally different interests creates problems. It creates rules that are not uniform across the board. It creates some transfer portal confusion with SEC players not being able to transfer to SEC schools, but only at certain times of the year. So there's a lot of confusion that goes on just because we have five, or technically four really at this point, four different bodies that are working pretty much not in tandem, but totally unilaterally for what their best interests are. So it creates this issue that I think could only be 10 times worse if we get into a world where we're paying athletes with contracts and we're doing this type of thing. Those rules almost have to be uniform, because if they're not uniform, then it's going to be an arms race for who has the most lenient rules around contracts and around NIL and around the transfer portal, because that's what players want, right? The players want that extra power, and unless you come to a consensus of what this transfer portal is going to look like, what the payment for these players is going to look like, whether that's through revenue sharing and contracts for multiple years, or that's a one year type deal and you keep the transfer portal going the way that it has been, it doesn't necessarily matter. It just has to be unison across college football, or at least across the major conferences. We talked about the Group of Five playoff a little bit, I believe last week, maybe on Monday. I cannot remember. It all kind of blends together. But regardless, the Power Five is its own thing, and it should be its own thing, and we've talked about that a number of times. And they have to be working in unison. If they're working where the SEC and the Big Ten are at least kind of on the same page, and then the Big 12 and the ACC are kind of on the same page, or maybe the Pac-12, whoever knows what happens with the ACC. I'm still wildly confused on what's going on there. There was a new development there we'll get to tomorrow. But point is, all of these conferences just have to work in unison going forward. If you want the sport to be the best version of itself, if you want the sport to remain, some of what we love about the sport, these four conferences just have to move in tandem. They have to move in unison. And if they don't, it creates more turmoil. Oh my gosh. It creates more problems. It creates a lot more pressure on these conferences, and probably a lot more division between them. So this is obviously a great thing when you bring in revenue sharing to college football. I think it's something that a lot of people have been in favor for quite some time, to be totally honest with you, and it's taken quite a while to get here. But the reality is, this does create some hurdles that have to be, leaped over, whether it comes to setting up the contracts the right way, and making sure that they are maybe multi-year, and stuff like that. Making sure that the conferences are moving in tandem and have the same rules and have the same regulations, and don't set up one conference to, soar in this new era while one conference really struggles because they have different rules in place. So this is a good thing. This is a step in the right direction to get everything under control, to get a handle on NIL and tampering, to have an understanding of what's going on in the transfer portal and with roster construction, and have a little bit of clarity in college football. But there are things that have to be overcome to get to that point where there is clarity across the board. Because it'd be great to know what's going on in the SEC and the Big Ten, but if the ACC and the Big 12 don't follow suit, then you have a reality where the SEC and the Big Ten probably break off from the other two and create even more division. So that's obviously not what we want, but this is a step in the right direction. Hopefully the ACC and the Big 12 can get in the room with these two conferences and kind of figure out what the next steps are, because if they're not all moving in tandem, it could be an interesting couple of years. I'll put it that way. But we'll see what happens there. We'll unpack that as it happens, and hopefully some other conferences can come into this conversation. But one of the teams have come into this conversation. UAB has joined a players association that I want to get to right after this. We'll talk about kind of the impact of that and what some other teams might do. Is this kind of a door opening moment for a lot of these teams, or is this just kind of a blip on something that might not define the future? But we'll get into all that right after this, so stick with us.